Welcome to week 6 in our Shifting Romance with Israel course. And I want to just today offer a few personal reflections on this time period that we've been looking at over the past week or so, and some concepts with regard to Messianic Jewish ministry and cultural identification of the gospel presentation with the target group. But first, let me go back here to share just some personal things that I experienced as one living through much of this history and experiencing it firsthand. In 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War, there was great jubilation throughout the Christian world. Certainly, somehow God had intervened. He had rescued Israel from certain destruction, and it had been such a one-sided victory, sort of like David lopping off Goliath's head, that the whole world was stunned, and particularly the Christian evangelical world and Pentecostal worlds who concluded this surely meant that the time of the second coming is right at hand. And that's the way it continued then for some months. Wasn't too very long, however, after that once again the saber rattling began in the Arab world, and there were other kinds of voices coming alongside them to protest Israel and its refusal to surrender conquered territories and whatnot. That Israel was under attack, and many of the Christians, especially denominational leaders, organizations, began to seriously back away from Israel, expecting that soon and very soon she would be, since she hadn't come to Jesus yet, that she could really be in a difficult position and face national destruction. So we see, for example, some ominous signs. You have to remember, I'm now in 1969, I'm a junior in Bible college. I have been called to Jewish ministry for 7 years, expecting upon graduation to move to Israel and launch our Jewish ministry in Israel. But in 1969, at the age of 21, suddenly it became clear that the Assemblies of God, my group, with whom I aspired to have credentials and work for a lifetime with, was just ready now to sell the one remaining property the Assemblies of God owned in the whole land of Israel. Can you imagine? Israel has just retaken the old city. Israel is going through this tremendous revolution in terms of a spiritual revitalization. There is an ongoing messianic ministry that is reaching out to ever larger numbers of people. There are evidences of revival. And much to my chagrin and pain at the time, 1969, the Assemblies of God sold its marvelous piece of real estate. If you know Jerusalem at all, you'll know where King George Street comes into Hayesod, comes into Ben Maimon Street, Agron Street. This is a 5-way intersection all coming together at the foot of this property, which was owned by the Assemblies of God since about 1929. But in 1969, after 40 years of owning it, and after 2 years of the Six-Day War being successfully fought and won, now they decided they needed to sell the property for $250,000, property which probably today is worth $100 million. But at that time, the funds were felt would be more advantageously used in Brussels to launch the Continental Bible College, to pay realtor fees, and to buy an apartment for some of the God missionaries that were there. So basically, that was an omen. That was a sign of a certain amount of lack of faith, a lack of expectation. How could anything good really happen among the Jewish people? How could there be revival among the Jewish people? This really wasn't within our dispensationalist mindset now. I mean, we'd already transitioned from being a restorationist group into being more of a dispensationally minded group. So now was not the time for the Jews to be saved. Therefore, there was no great urgency for us to hold this property or to see what could be done in subsequent years. So with all of the faithlessness manifested with this, the property was sold. As the next years went by, there was this growing anger in the world against Israel. At the same time, there were oil threats. There were oil problems. The 1973 war, Yom Kippur War, fought in Israel, was of course a surprise attack upon the Jewish nation from its surrounding neighbors on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, when it's against the law to use a telephone or a radio or watch TV or drive a car, where it's absolutely the holiest day of the year. On this very day, this very occasion, the Arab nations conspired to bring devastating attack upon Israel, and Israel was caught, unfortunately, very flat-footed at this time. It took many, many weeks for that war to finally conclude with some sort of a truce. I don't think either side really won the war. Israel, of course, claimed victory. The other side could also claim victory, but it was a devastating war for Israel by any account, and it demonstrated to the world that Israel was indeed vulnerable. That whereas the Six-Day War had made Israel appear to be David and invincible, the Six-Day, the Yom Kippur War now made Israel appear to be a behemoth, a giant military force that could in fact be defeated and suffer grave losses. So there was a backing away of a lot of the support, the Pentecostal, the evangelical support for the state of Israel, a calling up of the realization that Israel had not yet come to a place of faith in Jesus, and we shouldn't put too many eggs in Israel's basket because we don't know what's going to happen down the road. At the same time, right on the heels of that, you have the 1973-1974 oil boycott. The oil boycott, which people my age well remember as times when oil was so shortly, there were such shortages of available oil that we had a hard time buying gasoline. So often, even when I was living in Southern California at the time, we would have to go to the gas station only every other day. We would only be permitted to buy 10 gallons of gas at a time, and the lines for buying gas may be 2 blocks, 4 blocks, 10 blocks long, where people would just stand in line on the streets, park the car on the streets for long blocks, waiting their turn to get up to the pump where they could pump their own 10 gallons, and that would have to hold them for the next 2 days. These were very difficult days across America where everybody was really resenting the whole oil crisis. And this, instead of being angry at the Muslim world or the Arab world, the petroleum owners, many people in the United States decided to turn against Israel and against the Jewish people, because we had been supportive of Israel during the Six-Day War and supportive of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, that somehow we were being blacklisted by the Arab world, boycotted by the Arab world. We had all this suffering upon the American masses as a result of American enthusiasm for Israel. And so bumper stickers began to appear on American vehicles, especially in the Midwest, that read like, "Burn Jews, not oil." There was a growing anti-Semitism that was sweeping across the United States. And the media, of course, didn't help things at all. The Palestinians were more and more made to appear as victims. And the public sentiment was less and less enthralled with Israel and the Jewish people, and more concerned about the potential consequences of that connection, and more aware of not only the Palestinians but the entire Islamic world. In fact, this was so much so that even in a group like the Assemblies of God, and again, the Assemblies of God are my people, my group, so I don't mean to target them in this way, but I happen to know what the facts are in this case. Really, from the mid-1970s then, in all of the articles and periodicals and newsletters and all the youth the newsletters and all that sort of thing that were going out across America, out of the Gospel Publishing House, out of the Assemblies of God headquarters, nothing more favorable toward Israel was published after about year 1976. So think of it. It's been 40 years now, 40 years, since anything has come out in the Assemblies of God press that would be favorably disposed toward Israel, towards the Jewish nation. That's not to say that the Assemblies of God were not supportive of Jewish evangelism. They've always been very supportive of Jewish evangelism. It's not to say they had any qualms about Messianic synagogues. They've always been very supportive of Messianic synagogues. But when it's come to the Jewish state, the only favorable things that the Assemblies of God have said in the last 50 or 40 years towards Israel is that there has been a new archaeological discovery, or the Bible Society has had new freedoms to distribute copies of Scripture, or there's going to be an Assemblies of God tour to the Holy Land. But beyond that, the traditional supposition of God accomplishing great miracles in and through the Jewish people somehow left out of the equation, because no longer did the denomination want to be identified as it had with Israel. This became all the more accentuated when a good friend of mine, forgot his name now, it'll come back to me in a minute, David, my good friend David, pioneered what's called the Center for Muslim Ministries in 1982. It was actually David Irwin, I-R-W-I-N. David Irwin was actually my professor when I was a student at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, and he had been a missionary for many years in the Muslim world, and now was teaching at the seminary, and pioneered a ministry called the Center for Muslim Ministries. And this caught the imagination of the Pentecostal masses. This captured the focus of the Assemblies of God denominationally, because the whole world was thinking Islamic. The whole world now was thinking about the importance of the Arab people, the importance of petroleum, and the great need there was in the Islamic world for the gospel to be proclaimed. So the world is now focusing more and more upon the Islamic world, and the denominations supposed, and were largely influenced by missionaries to the Islamic world. The denominational leaders supposed that they could not say anything favorable toward Israel without risking Pentecostal image in the Islamic world. So again, the denomination went out of its way to disconnect, to disassociate, to be careful to not say anything positive about Israel, the government of Israel, the policies of Israel. Nobody came to the defense of Israel. Nobody suggested that the propaganda was being stacked against Israel. Nobody protested the fact the United Nations were coming out with unfair resolutions against Israel. None of this seemed to make any difference to the denomination. At the same time, for many years now, we'd had the charismatic movement happening, and that had, carried forward, producing different schools within the charismatic movement of dominion theology or kingdom now theology, all of which these charismatic strands, dominion theology strands, kingdom now strands, have been largely created or formed by people who had come out of the historic churches into the Pentecostal experience, bringing tongue speaking with them, but also their supersessionist or replacement theology with them. And so now they were prepared to think more like amillennialists, thinking that not only was the state of Israel of no particular significance or meaning, the 1948 revival of the state of Israel meant nothing in terms of God's economy. They even went so far as to say that the Pentecostal outpouring at the beginning of the 20th century had no particular significance or meaning. In other words, in their way of thinking, all God is concerned about is what's happening today, and the church needs to come back to its Book of Acts experience in every generation, and world redemption through the agency of the church is God's program, and that Israel and the Jewish people have no continuing role or any kind of significance going forward. So this was now sort of a revitalized tongue-speaking form of supersessionism, and this was a definite challenge to conventional, traditional, Pentecostal, American support for Israel. Now that gave rise, of course, over the course of time to new reactionary groups coming up that were really pro-Israel and really resented the disconnect with Israel or the condemnation of Israel. They began to characterize more and more elements of Christianity, and they expressed disappointment even with the Pentecostal groups, who are now backpedaling on their biblical commitments to Israel and finding ways to justify entering the camp of those who wanted to be neutral, as though God was neutral. They wanted to be neutral. And so we see the rise of many new kinds of organizations like Bridges for Peace or the Christian Embassy of Jerusalem. Later we'll find the Christians United for Israel with John Hagee, and of course one group which makes no claim of genuine Messianic faith, the Hillel Eckstein's, the Fellowship of Christians and Jews. All of these groups now began taking vast resources of money, often with the donors thinking they were giving to Jewish evangelism, thinking that they were giving to groups that wanted to proclaim the gospel to Israel, were in fact supporting groups that simply wanted to do humanitarian works or wanted to sort of politically represent Israel to the American government, or serve as lobbyists in the American Senate or Congress to try to persuade congressmen or political parties to be supportive of Israel. But people were supporting these kinds of efforts and supporting them at the cost or at the expense of real kingdom enterprise, which is giving the gospel to Jewish people. So while there were those dispensationalists who had come along and say, well, now's not the time for the Jews to be saved, they're to be saved in the utopian future, they fully ignored the fact that God's desirous that every Jewish person receive Yeshua today, and that all Jewish people find Him to be their Lord and Messiah and experience the new birth even this afternoon. Instead of embracing a gospel that really is available for all peoples, they wanted to suggest the Jews were in this category where the gospel would only have application to them in the utopian future or during the millennium. Well, as the charismatic realm backed away from Israel and the Jewish people, and began to just call Israel names and mock Christians for being supportive of Israel at all. The societies, Pentecostal societies, began to move in this direction as well, just casting off Israel as some kind of a Jewish pain in the neck in the Middle East that had caused so many problems for the world today. And how embarrassing is it that Christians wanted to connect with Israel and the Jewish people. These kinds of groups began to face new challenges from the likes of somebody that I really grew to love, a man by the name of Stanley Horton. Stanley Horton. You may notice, if you've got a copy of my paperback book on the shifting romance with Israel, right on the front is a little logo suggesting that he is the one who wrote a foreword to my book. And Stanley Horton had been my professor, in fact, at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. He proved to be a great friend to Jewish ministry. He was also a leading thinker in Pentecostal theology over the past half of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. He never had embraced dispensationalism, had always felt that Israel and the church were to work in tandem towards the interests of the kingdom of God, not one or the other, but working alongside in harmony as full partners. And so I was happy when I submitted my dissertation to him. I was writing the dissertation for the Hebrew University, and when I had my copy ready for his reading, I wanted him to read it and review it, and he read it, and I was happy that he sent me an email saying that everything that I said about him was true, and he, in fact, was highly supportive of Israel and the things that I had documented with regard to his support for Israel and his challenge of many of the Pentecostal theologies or dispensationalist ideas were accurate. Stanley Horton, of course, was a voice that stood head and shoulders among almost everyone in the Pentecostal world in terms of his theology. He was one of the original founders of the Society for Pentecostal Studies. He was a bulwark, a prolific author, wrote hundreds and hundreds of articles, scores and scores of books. His books were used not only across America and all of the Bible colleges, but really in Assemblies of God and other Pentecostal schools around the world. Internationally recognized scholar. And he stood with Israel, and he took on groups like the Society for Pentecostal Studies and confronted them with a realization that they've got to stop this business of stepping away from Israel, of compromising their support for the Jewish state, of wanting to fall back into some kind of a replacement theology, supersessionism, because he said the Pentecostal destiny was inseparably bound together with Israel's destiny. So Stanley Horton and Amos Millard and others began to come forward and confront the Pentecostal world in terms of their increasingly backslidden attitude towards Israel and God's promises and commitments to Israel and the Jewish people. I mean, for Pentecostals of all people to suggest God didn't mean what he literally said, it's all to be understood metaphorically or spiritually or allegorically, that may be fine for a medieval or dark ages Catholicism, but that certainly can't be in a Pentecostal position. Not after the Reformation, not after the coming of the outpouring of the Spirit in the 20th century, and the revitalization not only of the church but of the house of Israel and the restoration of the Jewish state. This clearly is a sign that the Bible must be taken literally. That God's promises are yea and amen. He wasn't speaking tongue-in-cheek. He wasn't wanting people to sort of read between the lines and grasp something other than what he was actually saying. He meant what he said what he meant, and people were to understand this correctly. I'm happy to tell you that our ministry, Israel's Redemption, which is an Assemblies of God Jewish ministry, had Stanley Horton serve as one of our board members. Until his passing a year and a half ago. Stanley Horton finally passed away at 98 years of age. So though he had officially retired from teaching and writing at different periods in his life, I think his last retirement was finally when he was 80 years old or 85 years old. He nevertheless continued on my board until he was 98 years old and went into the presence of the Lord, and continued to stand by the cause of Jewish evangelism and support for the Jewish state. In fact, he was born in 1916, so he would just be turning this year 100 years of age. Well, with all of this that is happening politically, with all that is happening denominationally, with all of the backslidden mindset of Pentecostal and charismatic groups with regard to the central role that Israel is to play in God's economy, with all of the refusal to say anything nice about Israel in Pentecostal periodicals for the last 40 years, with all of that, still the kingdom of God was continuing to move forward in the Jewish world, and somehow Pentecostals were still engaged. When we come to our teaching next week, you will have read this week's lectures, and I want to have a discussion about the planting of Messianic synagogues and reaching out to the Jewish people with an awareness of the importance of Israel, a value for Jewish culture, and how to more wonderfully impact the Jewish people everywhere in today's world for the gospel. Because really, I'm not content, and I'm sure the Lord is not content to simply thrust the salvation of Israel and the Jewish people off to a utopian future. Because now is the day of salvation. Now is the day of salvation, and there's no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. And the salvation is available to everyone, whosoever will. Whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So how does that translate into real, ongoing, successful Jewish evangelism, Jewish discipleship, Jewish congregation planting, and how did that play out in the Pentecostal world in the 20th century, and what is happening today in terms of the contempt, the large growing contempt that there is in the Christian world towards all things Messianic. We'll look at these things next week. Meanwhile, have a blessed week. Look forward to seeing you online. God bless you.